things.
Okay, we're recording.
Do you want to introduce Rosie? Shall I jump in?
Go for it, Daniel.
Okay, folks. This is a session where we're talking about a very complex project, which is scale cubed. And I want to immediately jump in with the lecture, with the PowerPoint. And so let me do my share screen and get this thing going. Can you give me a hand signal? Is this, can you see this screen, please?
Yep.
Okay, good. Scale cubed is learning how to work within the complex adapting systems of humanity, okay? Human beings are unpredictable. Our systems cannot be controlled, especially right now in the global world. But scale cubed works. And when you get the system working, you can direct the complexity of for justice, for sustainability. But the key is you must work with the system. Don't try to fight the system. You will lose. Work with the system. Get the parts of the system that cause positive change growing. That's what Scale Cube does. Let's do a little refresher course now. The common model for scaling up is this idea that you start a project, you feed it money, you milk the project for good things, and positive change scales up. The more money you put in the front end, the more milk comes out the bottom end. But there's a problem almost always with the conventional scaling up model, which is that the poor don't get help. And I bet everybody in this class has seen this idea that the government or some donor is trying a project and everybody in the middle gets something, but the people at the end do not. So rather than concentrating on inputs and outputs, you need to concentrate on the process. Let me say this does not mean that inputs are not important. This does not mean that outputs don't happen. But you've got to get the whole complex system working. It's not so simple as an input and output. So, as we talked about at the beginning of this class, there are basically 4 different approaches. And I've put the names here, but would somebody in the class tell me what the additive approach is? What is it? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of the additive approach? Please grab this question because you can see that the next 3 questions that I'm going to be asking you are different. So grab the one you know the answer to, folks, because I want you to answer these 4 questions or suddenly this class is over.
So just jump in. We can't see your hand if you have your hand raised because Daniel has the share screen up. Matt.
The additive.
Oh.
Yeah, go on, the additive.
Yeah, the additive approach evolves solution community by community.
Exactly. You're developing the solution community by community. So there are solutions and it is scaling up. But the solutions are distinctive community to community. What is the blueprint approach?
The,
Take one pattern from a different community and use it in another community, adapt it to another community.
Exactly. Okay, you take a blueprint, it's like an engineering drawing of a school, for instance, or a health service, and you then take it from one community to another. In the additive approach, you developed a new one for each community that fit that community. In the blueprint approach, you take a standard model. What happens in the explosion approach?
Gunjan brought in a nice point in the chat, which is that outside design is introduced in the blueprint.
Exactly. Thank you. And I can't follow the chat room. So please, everybody, this is a participatory process. Thank you, Gunjan. You're totally correct. Explosion approach.
Just something along the lines of like a reactionary plan in regards to like a disaster that is kind of like a band-aid solution to just get through a one-time event or an irregular event.
Matt, I've never heard the word reactionary used. You are 100% right. Thank you for expanding my understanding. It is exactly right. It's a reactionary solution. It can be a Band-Aid or it can be very effective. We have a pandemic happening. And so we try an explosion approach of doing vaccinations. Okay, it's a reaction. Absolutely correct. This is a really smart class. You guys are learning your lessons. Okay, what's the biological approach?
and
This
a
one
biological
reacts more in an, oh, what?
Go on.
Kristen, go on, and then Melchior can chime in.
I was gonna say this one's more of a naturally occurring, as you could say. So you're adapting to these different things and building on them as you go, kind of in a natural growth process. You're learning as you go, and then you're making changes during that.
Absolutely brilliant. Melchiade, you wanted to add in. Kristen's right, but please say some more.
I think that may have been Herman. Herman, were you
Oh,
trying
sorry,
to
Herman.
also respond?
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, Herman, please, biological approach.
Hello.
Hello.
I have some problems. I didn't see all the screen and I can't listen.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, okay. Let me send you a message on chat to try to work out your tech issues.
Meanwhile, I'm going to keep going because you folks are 100% right, but let's get into the subject more deeply. So
Hello.
in the inside of the biological approach is this idea of the positive feedback loop of revolution of rising aspirations. We've talked about this.
So Daniel,
Yeah.
if we're moving on beyond, can you go back one slide? There's an important point I want to highlight in the reading from this week. No, to the biological, there you go. I just want to draw everybody's attention. This is a very important reading for the class. In many ways, this chapter really synthesizes this entire class very, very nicely. And in this chapter, when you think about these approaches, it talks about the role of community. And it says very clearly in the blueprint approach, community is the setting for an outside design. In the explosion approach, it is the target. In the additive, it is the resource. And in the biological, it is the agent. That is a very key point. Go back and reread that chapter. Memorize that. You will understand these approaches very well if you understand that they are using a different definition. The community is playing a very different role. Daniel, sorry for interjecting. I just wanted
No,
to.
thank you for interjecting. That's the very clear way of explaining what others have already done. It's deep in the understanding. Thank you very much. So in the community as the agent, the community is making it happen. The revolution of rising aspirations is how they do that. And we've talked about that. So I will be referring to this. I don't need to explain this to you again. I'm just emphasizing that what you see here in this feedback loop is an engine. Okay, it's an engine of internal human energies that grows the biological approach. But let's get into that engine a little bit now. Okay, and you can actually graph, as this is showing, that, for instance, if you take the domain of life improvements, that's health and education and these sorts of better nutrition on the bottom, or the domain of economic growth, which is rising economic resources and other resources. These two features of the power of economic growth and the power of rising life improvements are like a fuel for causing that revolution of rising aspirations to grow. And then what happens is that you get the qualitative and quantitative expansion happening. So on this part of the graph, you get the number of participants growing. You get your pool of human energy growing. And then on this side of the graph, over here on the right side, you get the quality of life improving with civic engagement and better nutrition. So these are measurable functions, but what is important is putting them all together, because in coming together into a system, that's what causes the dynamic of internal growth of community as agent. Now, in scale 1, there are problems, and I want to talk about them. Because the first problem is what my sister, as referenced in the chapter, who's an anthropologist, calls the grass floor. Many of you have heard about grassroots development, okay? That's the rising up of the community. Community is the agent. Community is growing up. That's grassroots development. There's a grass floor, which is how to reach the unreached, how to reach the grass, how to reach into the roots of the grass. Many of you, I am sure, are good at community mobilization. Many of you in your papers and descriptions of your seed have described your ideas and your experience at breaking through the grass floor and reaching the unreached. But now, as we're moving from scale 1 to scale squared and scale cubed, the challenge is breaking through the grass ceiling. And this is not a mobilization of the people, which is the grass floor project, the community activism part of it. Breaking through the grass ceiling is learning how to manage the whole complex system that is always changing. And inability, lack of ability to manage, and tends to focus on the features of scale squared. So to move from scale 1 to scale squared, you need to learn 2 skills. Number 1 is to extend action learning instead of just doing empowerment, 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 stimulating communities. You need to know how to do extend learning, action learning, learning by doing. And you need to grow continuing experimentation, adopt, adapt, adeptly. So now we get into scale squared. Okay? This, you can see the revolution of rising aspirations in all these little curves all over the screen. Community A, community B, community C. Each one of those communities is now doing the empowerment function. But your job is to cause this to happen through action learning and experimentation instead of direct mobilization. You're moving from being a community activist. You're moving from being a motivator to being both a teacher and a scientist. Okay? And so in the scale squared process, growth is driven by action and experimentation. So it becomes a self-learning system. You are no longer the key person making it happen, or your community is no longer. The community, the experience itself is reinforcing itself. This is a big change in the way you think and work. And when you can make this transition from going back here in scale 1 to going through the glass ceiling into creating a scale squared center where these ideas are adapting and growing and demonstrations are happening, then what you see happening is that there's communication happening across all of these features. Community D is working with community B. Community F is working with community wherever. You just cannot predict. The whole is readjusting. Now, until this point in this course, we've talked a lot about relationships, and that in complex adaptive systems, what causes the parts to create a new whole is relationships. But what causes relationships to go and grow is communication. Your job, your secret, your magic sauce is to improve communications among your communities. If you can improve communications, and if those communications are emphasizing successes, and if they are strengthening partnerships 3 ways, and if they are assembling evidence, then behaviors are changing, and all of this complexity is communicating one to another.
So, Daniel, I just want to jump in that
Right.
this slide is mislabeled. This should say what happens in scale cubed.
Oh, yes.
And so go back. Let's walk through these just so people really understand. So here you have scale squared. Okay, and that's looking specifically at the role of action learning and experimentation. And in that case, there's normally something in the center, right? That's the self-help center. And then if you go to the next slide, scale cubed, and unfortunately this one is mislabeled, but you can see and that this is certainly a different graphic. And notice that there is no center to this, right? This is a true biologically functioning network. In seed scale, we like to use other analogies, things like bamboo or an aspen grove. Whereas it really it's a root network of its own. And that's different from the different natural analogy, which is the spider plant. And the spider plant is closer to a scale squared center, where it is incubating, it is training. But in this graphic specifically, notice we still have scale squared happening as a function. Scale squared is informing certain nodes in this network. But then that experimentation is exchanging across itself. So it's not to say that you evolve and suddenly you move from scale squared to scale cubed, but that the functionality of your scale squared, your action learning and experimentation, start to function within a broader network. And so you're learning from other scale squared centers, you're working with different points of application. And so this is why we call these dimensions, is because it's a different perspective. It's a different layer of the scaling up process. And it relates to where the intentionality and where the momentum is coming. Because once you really start to participate in a broader network of social change, you are part of a much larger process. You're no longer directing it. You've given up you're controlling. There are elements of control maybe at the scale squared function, but you are not in control of that broader network. And so your role changes. Sorry, Daniel, I just wanted to...
No, don't be sorry. Very helpful and very important. And sorry for mislabeling the slide, but Luke has done a brilliant job of explaining the mislabeled slide. Thanks very much, Luke. Now I want to switch and talk about some examples. The readings gave several examples. Okay, New York City, which I'm not going to talk about here, but New York City is one of the greenest cities in America. Okay, it's one of the most continually evolving, century upon century. The Model Counties of China was an intentional project that was led by my father, an outsider, that went China-wide. We've talked about these examples and others. But what I want you to start to do now, as you go into your now current lab assignment, is start to be thinking, start to be designing for scale 1, scale squared, and scale cubed. Because Luke's point that he just made right now is that these are not sequential. That when you get scale cubed happening, all 3 are happening. Okay. And so what I want to now do is to give some summary points that came out of the Tibet example of how this all comes together. And they come together always in partnership. So instead of in scale cubed, what you must understand is that the enabling environment is the top down. You've got to use whatever government you have. You've got to use whatever businesses you have. Your job is not to cause a revolution. Okay? So in scale cubed, all sectors join in partnership. And when that happens, the bottom up, which becomes the major force, is engaging with education and management and resources. And your opportunity is this tiny little person outside in influence to change the system. And in just a few minutes, Rosie is going to give an example of how one of you, as a tiny little example, one of your alums who graduated before you, in a class before you, made this partnership happen. But in the example here, you have created and brought in the 4 great areas, rivers areas, the most isolated part of the planet, huge system change, and it requires understanding. It requires mapping. Don't just get the data, map it so that everybody can see it. And then in that mapping project, this larger area, gather local evidence and grow local partnerships, because everything has to be rooted, going back to the point that Luke emphasized in the beginning, community is the agent. So you've got to be rooting all of this with local evidence and local partners so that community is truly growing examples across this region as Scale Cube is happening. But in order for that extension to happen, in order to make people want to act instead of being act because some big authority of government or some money agencies happening, you've got to find dramatic examples that cause people to become excited. And in this case, it was the deepest gorge on the planet. It's 5 miles from the top to the bottom. Imagine in one valley looking up and down 5 miles. Or find emotional aspects, stories of people that tear open their passions. In this case, a very rare monkey that we focused on, but something that caused people's emotions to get involved with an intellectual process. And also talk about the dangers. Bring forward the urgency to take action so that people make participation a topic of today rather than a topic of tomorrow. That requires urgency, and it shows that we must act now. And then you have to put all of this together. This is documentation, folks. This is a different skill from being the charismatic leader who made Scale 1 happen. This is pretty daggone sophisticated to put this data together in GIS or economic modeling or human modeling. But if you don't, you're not grasping the complexity of the system. And then this information has to go public. Now, in the case of what we did in China, I didn't mention earlier, but I'll just share with you what happened. We showed about the deforestation. In this picture. You see trucks of the Chinese army. They're carrying out timbers. 350 trucks a day were carrying out timbers, deforesting this area. 350 Chinese army trucks a day. So what did we do? We quietly, secretly made a movie inside of China. And we mailed this movie to every TV station in China in a brown paper envelope. They didn't know where it came from. And all of a sudden, the information about the deforestation went public. And that started to affect larger Chinese attitudes. And it precipitated education. It precipitated meetings. The facts came forward. They were irrefutable. And from that process, then action started to take that we could monitor and we could measure change and we could learn from it. That's experimentation. And we improved those systems. And always we were getting the people as agents where they were benefiting in this whole process. And the last time I described the Pendaba project. And we mentioned how Norbu, who was a student in this master's program, developed this Pendaba program and won the United Nations Equator Prize. The people are benefiting. The people are benefiting within the context of national awareness. The people are benefiting within the context of positive examples and using local resources. And so that is creating a shift in the systems. It's going back to the graph that Luke very helpfully explained in detail of loops within loops communicating with each other. And so we had demonstrations of these these scale squareds happening in those larger loops to create the scale cubed experience. Model villages, resettlement programs. You may say, well, that's all very cool, but I can't do that. Well, folks, you can do that. It may not be China-wide, but you can do it in your area. You can create a scale cube process. And Luke and Rosie's going to tell you about it. But when you create it, this is what you're going to be doing, folks. You've been here. This is the beginning of this course. Remember, you saw this slide in the beginning of this class. Seeds of community successes. You've identified these in your labs. You've talked about the positive feedback loops of your revolution of rising aspirations. You've talked about how scale impact is occurring through rising numbers and rising quality. This is all, you've done this much already. So then you get into this whole process of scale. And what do we mean by scale? Whoa, folks, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. I'm trying to get this so that I can see it. So in scale, we have scale 1, okay? Scale 1, whoa, you gotta give me a break here, folks. Where does it go? There we go. In scale 1, well, let's go with scale itself. What does scale itself mean? It's a system for improving communities to adapt, learn, and expand. And in that system, improvements in life and the participation of others is happening. That's what's happening in the overall scale process. And then in scale 1, you're stimulating communities to grow in awareness so that they learn and so that their energy is engaged. Okay? You're stimulating, this is a direct cause and effect. You're stimulating communities' awareness to do this. And now when you get to scale squared, you're creating a self-help center or a chapter of people. It doesn't have to be a building, but it's where self-help, you're no longer doing it. People are doing it. And action learning and experimentation is happening so that there's an improvement in the quality of life that's growing. And that improvement is calling in more people. And then in scale cubed, we get a synthesis. We're bringing all the pieces together. We're bringing the pieces together as shown in that earlier graph that Luke talked about, to collaborate. And in collaborating, adapting and learning to extend. What is the common word through all of this? It's learning, 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 learning. While all these other things are happening, learning is happening, not the delivery of money, not the forcing of people. Through learning, people are changing, life is changing from the inside out. So I've been telling you that right now you were going to get a message from Rosie. So Rosie, before we open it for questions, over to you to share your story so that everybody here knows that they can do it.
Can I squeeze
Right.
in just to make 1 or 2 points about scale cubed? Okay, so we're going to be looking at scale cubed for the rest of the course. And I mentioned, if by any chance you happen to come to this class and didn't do the reading for this week, please do it. If you did come to class, I suggest you reread this chapter after the class. As I mentioned, this chapter really sums up the scale process, and that's what this course is all about. So this is one to really slow down on and focus on it. And specifically the very last paragraph of the chapter. In it, it says that, and this is scale cubed, that as we move from scale squared to scale cubed, you have to realize how the dimensions and how your perspective is going to change with the dimensions, because at scale cubed, you are looking at action at the level of the whole system. That's from the chapter. Okay, and as Daniel showed, our role, when it's scale squared, the things to remember are action learning, and experimentation. Okay, now that we're in cubed, we're moving, and there are 3 real features of scale cubed as you take action across the whole system. One is collaboration. It's what the C stands for. The next, adaptive learning. That's what the A and the L stand for. So function 1 is collaboration. Function 2 is adaptive learning. And the last is extension. Okay, it's easy to read the acronym, synthesis of collaboration, adaptive learning, and extension, and think of them as all one idea. There are 3 distinct functions in there. Make sure you're thinking about them all as you think about action at the level of the whole system. So we'll talk more about that in other classes, but I really wanted to make sure everyone understood as we move from just focusing on action, learning, and experimentation at scale squared, or the stimulating awareness and energy at scale 1, to now focusing on collaboration, adaptive learning, and extension. All right, Rosie, over to you.
Great. So as Daniel mentioned, I want to share an example of a Future Generations alumnus who has been exactly where you are today. He was part of the first master's cohort in the graduate school. His name is Kelly Brown, and he is a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation in British Columbia, Canada. And when he came to the master's program in 2003, he and his people, the Heiltsuk, were just starting to look at how they can create a sustainable land use plan for their territory. So the Heiltsuk have been on this little island in British Columbia for 14,000 years. He was in, discussions and trying to determine basically their autonomy over this land, working with the British Columbian government and the Canadian government. And so, as I mentioned, when he came to the master's program, basically his practicum, the project that he was working over the course of his 2 years in the program, was to create a sustainable land use plan for their territory, which is 35,000 square kilometers. And he, graduated with that plan in hand. From there, just to think of the time scale involved that a lot of you might come up against, it was about 5 more years before his nation was able to kind of create this brand new sustainability and stewardship arm of the nation that he now directs. And that's called the Heiltsuk Integrated Resource Management Department. So over that period of time, they're learning more. They're reorganizing the way that resource management and land use is managed within their people, and they were starting negotiations with especially the provincial government and with industry. So now fast forward, and I would just had the pleasure of spending a whole, I joined a couple of sessions for a day-long program that he and his fellow Heiltsuk members were the faculty on, where they are showing this amazing case example of how they have scaled up their work. So I listened to national representatives of the Canadian park system say the Heiltsuk people are leaders among the coastal First Nations in how to lead these negotiations and partner with business, because on their territory, again, 35,000 square kilometers, they have negotiated MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with 95% of all of the companies that do business there. So that is with logging, that is with, fisheries and outdoor recreation companies, and they come and do, tours to see the bears and see and go on canoeing trips. So they have created these collaborative relationships whereby they now have a say, and will say, you can come and work in our territory and bring other people to our territory, but you have to follow our guidelines, and you can't go to the most culturally sensitive places that are only for our people. So that's just one example within their territory. But what is really amazing is how since his studies, he now and the Heiltsuk Nation has partnered with 17 different coastal nations in British Columbia. They've gotten more strength in numbers, and they have been leading negotiations again with the government to protect and jointly manage the Great Bear Rainforest. So that is a 6.4 million hectare rainforest in British Columbia. It's about the size of the country of Ireland, okay, for a sense of scale. And they have negotiated that 85% of that is going to be protected indefinitely from any kind of logging or anything like that. And then the remaining 15%, the nations manage jointly with the the park and with the government, the Canadian government, to figure out how to do that sustainably. So it's a huge example, right? But the idea is that took a lot of time. I mean, we're talking over 15 years, 10, 15 years, that he and his team were able to progress from sort of the scale 1, scale 2, up to now really operating in a much larger statewide and national system in terms of adaptive learning. So this Great Bear Rainforest Agreement was reached in 2016. So it is now 2021, and they're in their first iterative process of reviewing that agreement, and they're renegotiating it bit by bit to see, okay, what hasn't really worked that well? Where do we have more room to improve, to make sure that everyone has a seat at the negotiating table, and not just that they are able to dictate, what it should be, but that the Heiltsuk Nation and the other nations also now have a role in enforcement to make sure that the policies that are set forth in this, stand. And just, yeah, so I could go on and on, but he and his team are really, doing amazing work by working across the different nations. They are without doubt a standout example for the other 634 First Nations across Canada and around the world. So we mentioned another alum, Norbu, who started the PENDABA program, who won the Equator Prize. And this year I'm working with Kelly to nominate him and his people for the UN Development Program's Equator Prize again.
Yeah, so we're working on that nomination to bring another alum through to the Equator Prize. But here is a point I want to emphasize. Thank you very much, Rosie. Most of you have in your communities oppressed people. Some of you come from ethnic groups that are discriminated against. In Canada, the Indigenous people are discriminated against. Kelly's people, Kelly as a little child, was taken from his community and sent into Canada to a boarding school where he could not learn his native language. where he could not practice his traditional beliefs and he had to learn a strange religion. He was told he was a second-class person because he was from the Helsinks, or a third-class person. Okay? Many of you can understand that. And his community had lost 90% of their population through disease. Okay? But they came together with a plan. And it began with a plan that was essentially a course paper. And as Rosie said, it took 15 years. Now, we're not asking any of you to run an independence movement. We're not asking any of you to start a nature preserve of millions of hectares. What we're telling you is each of you has the capacity to go from the seed that you've already started and identified to a scale that is appropriate to your situation. You shouldn't do something that's not appropriate, but each of you has in your hands a tool, a method, a system that you can use. So with that, we want to open to questions. Luke, you might, I know you have another point, but let's open for questions and comments after your point, Luke.
Sure. Well, I first, going back to the example of Kelly, I think there's a couple really important parts to this. And the first is listen in the example, whether it's the examples Daniel has put forward, the examples you've read about thus far in the course, this great example of the work that Kelly is doing. As they move in and are really starting to operate in this space, in these examples we've seen of scale cubed, the way that in Kelly's example is terrific, that of these three aspects of collaboration, adaptive learning, and then now extension through that. And I mentioned everybody to read that final paragraph in the chapter, reread it. And the reason is because it talks about the importance of iteration within the growth process, which is exactly what Rosie just described the Helsinki nations are doing in this project, because that's really key. The other thing that I will just say in parting, and then we will turn it over for questions, is that, as Daniel said, we are not saying that any of you start a revolution or an independence movement. But as you are operating in your own spaces of community change, many of us, most of us spend most of our time at scale 1 or scale squared. But do not limit your project by thinking it's confined to this, whether it's confined to only reaching a certain number of people, it's confined to only to a sector. Because Kelly did not actually start this process thinking he would be here in 15 years. I saw some comments in the chat window about it takes a lot of patience. Well, it takes patience if that's actually where you think you're going to end up. If you're just bonding to the situation and circumstances in front of you, using this process that you've now been learning for the past year, results emerge, the growth emerges. Think back to ACC 601. Emergence and emergent growth is what got the Helsinki nations here. They did this through action learning and experimentation. They're now doing it through collaboration, adaptive learning, and extension. But the process is the same. They are not following a blueprint approach. There is no master plan here that is dictating or laid out 15 years ago that they would be here. That's the same for the QNNP and for the work in Tibet. But through this process, the emergent growth was able to hit this scale. And one reason is because as you scale up, the role of collaboration and adaptation becomes more important, and you cannot control it. You cannot plan it. So with that, let's hear some questions. Well, Irfani, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question about the definition of skill creep. Is it uh, uh, going to provide a context for skill one and skill scored both, or is it a synthesis of both of them? Is it providing a context, or is it a combined level of those two skills?
That is a very good question. I'm interested to hear Daniel's response. But I believe that my response, Irfani, would be that in many ways it is both. In order to maintain and have Scale Cubed continue to function, you need these other things transpiring. However, it also, when you're working at Scale Cubed, you are very much, as Daniel said, working, a lot of your attention is working in relation to the enabling environment. And so for that reason, it in many ways is both. And I think that one reason it's a great question is because it highlights the point that none of this work starts or stops with our involvement. We are just getting involved and helping to coordinate it. But the human energies are always ongoing. We have to work within the system we're provided. But as we work within that system, we hope to improve it. And the way we improve that is usually through localized action. Daniel?
Well, first of all, again, my congratulations for the question. It is a very deep question. And Luke is completely right. It is both. But then the question is, how do you do it? Okay? How do you do the impossible? Because either of your tasks was difficult, but then when we say do them both, it becomes impossible. But it is possible by focusing always on the iterative process of making it a little bit better each time. Because in that iterative process of making it better, hope is growing and you will be getting partners. You will be getting stronger. Right now, Irfani, my heart is with you and every citizen of your country of Afghanistan. You have some great challenges in your country that the whole world is with you. I promise you, and certainly everybody in this class. And everybody in this class has got great challenges. But if you make some hope in synthesis and some progress, suddenly you will not be alone. And you will be growing a scale cubed environment. So may Allah's mercies and strengths be with you there in Afghanistan. With COVID and famine and war and poverty and internally displaced peoples. But you know, folks, we all have these problems in different ways.
Are there any other questions on scaling up? Thank you, Irfani, for a wonderful question. I think it's really central to today's theme and topic.
I don't know how much where this question falls, but I was just doing some reading this morning and I was wondering if from establishing the scaling process, if there's conversation or thought around, does it just end at scale cubed, or is there a conversation of, I see like a scale to the fourth being part of the process of scaling up, and I don't know, it popped into my head and I'm curious as to if there's still development within the scaling up process in
Yeah, I mean, the question is what you would engage as the key dimension. Remember, scale 1, squared, and cubed are all dimensions. And in our discussions way back 25 years ago, with the UNICEF task force, we did talk about as a fourth dimension, and it was time. That you have to learn to use time. And that when you're learning to use time, you get the force of all the other dimensions supporting you: experimentation, collaboration, synthesis. Time is like a river. And when you learn to ride time, you can navigate the white waters and the difficulties. But beyond that high theoretical level, Matt, I don't know. You know the song from the Beatles, "Let It Be, Let It Be."
Well, and Matt, I think that one of the important points is, are we thinking about the process or the result, right? And so I would say you really do kind of yes, that once you go beyond scale cubed, you get into the time and that whole space, which as somebody who loves philosophy, I could hang out there, but that's a little bit different from this. But I think it at that point is, you don't just it's this, since this is not a linear process, you don't get to cubed and then stop, right? Like, you get to cubed and the fun's just beginning. Try to maintain it, try to keep it continual, try to go from regional cube to global cubed, right? Like, so it just kind of changes, but the function stays the same. The basic, like, that collaboration, adaptive learning, extension, part of the point is you don't just do these things and then it's done, and you don't have to, it's a iteration is key here to keep it continual. Well, we're out of time. And so thank you everybody for a really great class. I think next week we will really, Rosie, am I correct? Next week we're going to really jump into the fourth lab assignment, or third lab assignment.
Yes, we'll be spending more time there. So please move ahead with step number 1. You'll want to be getting your feedback back from your communities, and we'll be addressing any technical questions that are arising for you on that.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day or evening, depending on where you are.